Hi guys, in today's video I'm going to be looking at the second part of the OCR specification with regard to scarcity and choice, and focusing today on two particular bullet points which I have on the board in front of me. Number one, evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the market economy, and then point number two, evaluate the role of the government within the market economy. Now, first of all, let's just be clear, when we have a directive word here which states evaluate, this is obviously going to be probably a 25-mark essay question. So a substantial amount of theory, a substantial amount of knowledge to be learned and then applied to this whole notion of the market economy, or indeed the wider issue of different market systems. So I've got 5 points here which I'm going to run through. I'll put a little card up to link to one or two other videos just to save me having to repeat things over and over again. So the first thing that I'm going to be talking about here is simply to do with the notion of the way in which resources are allocated within an economy. Now, of course, that can be within any particular country, and dependent upon the country concerned, it depends whether or not we use a market system, a planned economy, or a mixed economy. But regardless of which type of system we use, we will always be considering what goods to produce, or what goods and services to be produced, how those various goods and services should be produced, and for whom those goods and services should be produced. Now, those are the three fundamental questions that any economy needs to consider when it is deciding which economic system to use in order to allocate its resources. So let's now move on to talk about the different economic systems. I'm sure you'll know there is a wide spectrum of economic system. On the one hand, the very extreme, we can have a pure free market economy or a pure free market system. Now, nowhere really do we get that ideal, that nirvana. However, some countries come close. So the likes of Hong Kong and the United States or somewhere like that is very much closer to this whole notion of a free market system. Whereas if you think of countries, particularly countries like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, which have very substantial and significant government intervention and provide lots of very high standard of in-kind benefits such as education and healthcare and so on and so forth, they would be much more towards this end of the spectrum. So on the one extreme we have the pure free market, on the other extreme we have this whole notion of the planned or the command economy, which we don't really see that much nowadays. Of course, we've got North Korea, we've got countries which, like for example, China or Cuba, which are still run very much under that whole communist ideology. However, they are moving away from this whole notion of a planned, centrally planned economy. And then anything in between we refer to as a mixed economy. So we in the UK are in a mixed economy. And in many ways that presents us with the best of both worlds, in the sense that if you are ill or if you need an education, then the state will provide it for you. There is that state intervention. However, if you wish to form your own business and to earn profit, then of course you're perfectly entitled to do so as well. So there's a healthy mix of both aspects of state provision, but also self-interest and the profit motive driving people forward to achieve their own goals. So what would we say then are the key characteristics of the free market? Well, I'll just list these. I'm not going to talk about them in that much detail, but the key characteristics would be, number one, private property. So we're the right to own, control and dispose of resources and to use them as we see fit. Number two, freedom of choice and freedom of enterprise. If we want to start our own business in whatever area, then we are able to do so. Self-interest, Of course, the profit motive provides the motive for many people to go out and to start their own business and to hopefully earn a profit as a result of their entrepreneurial flair, as it were. The price acts as a rationing device in the free market economy. And of course, the price mechanism, for which I have already done a previous video, and I'll put a little card up to that. The price mechanism is the way in which resources are allocated. Now, you need to know that diagram, the price mechanism or the market mechanism diagram, as I've referred to it here. You need to know that inside out, back to front. So really do focus on that, zoom in on my video on the price and the market mechanism, and have a real good understanding of that whole notion of allocation of resource, consumer sovereignty, efficiencies, short run and long run movements, and of course those of you who know your perfect competition market structure diagrams anyway, you'll know that inside out, I would hope. So those tend to be the key characteristics: private property, freedom of choice, freedom of enterprise, self-interest, competition, price, and the price mechanism. But of course, there are certain market failures, and I will look at these market failures in more detail, but you will, I'm sure, be familiar with the standard market failures that we would talk about with regard to the uneven distribution of income and wealth, the whole notion of inequalities in society, the whole notion of imperfect competition, public good provision, merit goods, demerit goods, etc., etc. So there are a whole host of these which we can look at in another video. I don't want to get caught up in that at this stage. And then we have the whole notion of the planned economy, a centrally planned economy where a centrally planned authority determines what goods you should consume, how they should be produced, and for whom they should be produced. Now, centrally planned economies, when I was doing my A-levels back in the early 90s, back in the early 90s, I remember sitting in my economics class and the USSR, the Soviet Union, was breaking up and transitioning at that time, and planned economies tend to be associated with lots of queuing, lots of rationing, lots of shortages, lots of price controls. And so not really one which is to the benefit of the wider society. One only need look at North Korea nowadays as a comparison. Okay, so hopefully you will know all of this stuff about the price and the market mechanism. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention here was just the whole notion of economies in transition. This has appeared in recent exam series, and I remember writing a practice paper and an answer booklet for this, and I just wanted to talk about some of the things that I included in the answer booklet. And an economy transitioning generally means one which is trying to open up and move away from the planned system more towards embracing the whole notion of the free market. And we see that, of course, in countries like Cuba and China, as I've already mentioned. But it's very problematic when you're an economy in transition. What you tend to find is that you experience a lot of problems, and here we have a brief list of some of those problems. So number one would be unemployment. Economies which are centrally planned tend to have a lot of government support, a lot of government protection really from outside competitive forces. When that is removed, the domestic firms cannot compete, and then people find, that they are laid off and made unemployed because they simply cannot compete with the global economic competitive forces. They find that prices rise suddenly in the economy. Planned economies, whilst the variety in terms of choice and so on of goods and services is very limited, they are, however, protected by government subsidy to ensure that the things which are produced are affordable. When we move from planned to free market, those types of subsidies are removed, and again prices rise. It's often the case that economies which are transitioning generally experience very quickly, very rapidly, a recession as they move in the first years of transitioning from planned to free market. And that is a combination of many factors, not least of which is, of course, the increase in unemployment as the economy is exposed to the global market forces. They find that they cannot sell their wares, their exports, and so as a consequence they import much more than they export, and so trade balance and trade deficit problems arise. Planned economies are notorious for having corrupt, maybe, governance, and as a consequence of that, that is very heavily ingrained in society and in the government organisations, and as a consequence, very difficult to rid the economy in the first years of transitioning from the whole corrupt practice, which might be very heavily ingrained in the economy. Find that there's increasing Gini coefficient. Now, Gini coefficient is, of course, a measure of inequality, and as that rises, that index or that decimal, currently in the UK it's about 0.35, something like that. Well, as it moves more towards 1, that indicates an increasingly uneven distribution of income and wealth. And so as a consequence of the rising Gini, countries are experiencing increasingly uneven distribution of income and wealth. And that, of course, arises because, generally speaking, the resources are owned by the elite. And there are not many of them, but many just ordinary folk. And so the disparity between the rich and the poor and the haves and the have-nots gets wider and wider. And then finally, what you often find is that, well, you talented people in the economy, they will decide, well, we realise that there are profit-making opportunities much more substantial to be had in other countries. And so they move abroad. And consequently, these economies experience the brain drain. Okay, so I hope that's been of some use, ladies and gentlemen.